The 2010 World Cup of South Africa was iconic for the entire continent. A tournament remembered for so many things and one that almost had the fairy tale ending. But instead it would be one that would end in nightmares for its star nation, Ghana. One injury time handball would have Luis Suarez in the bad books of the entire continent. One bad word about Jollof away from being tried in the court of the whole of Africa. One of the judges is Robert Mugabe, bro. He's not making it out of there. It would have massive implications for Ghana at the tournament and seemingly any tournament since then, because after delivering the most problematic hand that country's seen since Oscar Pistorius' bathroom, Ghana haven't managed to reach anywhere near the heights of 2010. 2022 even gave them hope of a revenge arc, only to end up on the same flight home as Uruguay from the tournament.
Pussy or what? Say something.
And now with a 2025 installment of the African Cup of Nations on the horizon, I mean barely on the horizon, the sun's still setting from the night before, they've already failed to qualify for their own continent's major tournament too. The first time they've missed out on an AFCON tournament since 2004. But why did Ghana miss out? What has happened to the Black Stars? And Nigerian jollof is better. Hold that. It's probably a bad time really to say that. Incredibly, it's actually quite easy to miss something like this, given how chaotic African football and the AFCON tournament as a whole can generally be. You got referees blowing for full time 10 minutes early, goalkeeper saving 5 penalties in a shootout, one random manager thinking a bottle of Buxton is gonna save every single problem in Mali at the same time. Jordan Ayew not qualifying for an international tournament is probably like the least surprising out of all of those things. But Niger's 2-1 victory over Ghana cemented one of the most pathetic and impressively awful qualifying campaigns of any major nation ever, generally. But to understand just how mad this actually is, we're gonna have to go back a little bit. Now, Ghana are a nation that have won the African Cup of Nations 4 times in their history, winning it in 1963, 1965, 1978, and 1982. Basically one of the first, like, sub-Saharan African nations to establish themselves, generally speaking, but also as a major footballing nation. As I said, they've won it 4 times, they've been runners-up 5 times. They're a major player in Africa, rarely qualified for the World Cup during this time. Instability in the 70s and 80s was kind of part of that problem. So their first appearance wasn't till 2006, but they'd still impressed, at least on the continental stage. So their World Cup story really only starts in 2010. Now, you already know how this story ends. After all, I ruined it in the intro.
The Ghana player miss a penalty, not me.
But Ghana had qualified for the 2010 World Cup out of Group D, a qualifying group that had Benin, Mali, and Sudan in it. We'll come back to Sudan a little bit later on. It wasn't a qualifying campaign that was too special, like really just expected. They won 4 out of their 6 games as the best seeded team, and that saw them as one of the African representatives for the first ever African World Cup. A 2010 World Cup that was of course iconic and had African culture stamped all over it. From vuvuzelas to a party atmosphere to a football that moved more chaotically than the Wikipedia page of basically any African Cup of Nations qualifying campaign ever. What do you mean Ethiopia got suspended as a whole country halfway through? This ball had no respect for the laws of physics or how bad Diego Forlan was in his time at Manchester United. Either way, the tournament kicked off and it was iconic from the start. South Africa drawing in the first game and bringing out that celebration from Shabalala. For Ghana, and things started well for them too. An Asamoah Gyan penalty gave them a win over Serbia in the first game, and the same formula earned them a draw against Austria in the second group stage match. They'd qualify second in the group for the knockout stages, face the USA in a round of 16, and Asamoah Gyan would once again be the hero in extra time to see them through to the final 8. He was again the hero, and I'm sure there was nothing that he could possibly do wrong for this nation. Next up though was the quarterfinals, and they were facing off against Uruguay, a side that had an informed Diego Forlan, an extremely young Luis Suarez, and plenty of other main characters. It started well when Suleiman Tari scored just before the break, only for Diego Forlan to once again score and equalise. But in front of 84,000 attendees, these supporters would see one of the most famous pieces of law in World Cup history, as after a corner late deep into injury time, Luis Suarez handled the ball on the goal line to prevent a Ghana goal. He was sent off and would watch from the sidelines as Asamoah Gyan would step up to take a penalty that would see an African side reach the semi-finals of a World Cup for the first time in history. Except the crossbar doesn't count as a goal. He missed with the last kick of the game. It would go to penalties later after extra time. Ghana would miss 2 of them, and heartache would see them flying home early. But despite the disappointment, Ghana had made a name for themselves. I mean, by the start of 2011, they were now up to 15th in the FIFA World Rankings, which was only 1 place off their previous highest, which was only 3 years earlier in 2008 anyway. This was like their peak. This was a golden age golden generation of Ghanaian footballers. They were above France. Though then again, France were choosing to play Sidney Govou over Thierry Henry, so that's probably to be expected. Above the likes of Japan, Turkey, Denmark, Mexico, Nigeria, Sweden, Belgium, Poland. I imagine San Marino. Though based on current form, probably not anymore. But going into the 2014 World Cup, and the Black Stars were up against it from the start. Their group stage exit was hardly embarrassing, given they were basically in the group of death, alongside Germany, Portugal, and the USA. They scored 4 goals and were only beaten by Portugal and the US thanks to very late goals. 2018, though, saw the start of a decline slightly. They didn't qualify for the World Cup, but they were in a pretty difficult group against Egypt. But more importantly, it was the end of the talisman Asamoah Gyan. He wasn't playing for Ghana anymore by this point, as well as key players like Kevin Prince Boateng, Michael Essien, and also Suleiman Tari. Ghana would be back for the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, but by this point, the steam had kind of already left them. The football was gone.
He needs to call it a day.
They weren't the usual bold selves, okay? They fell apart at the opportunity for a revenge arc, as I mentioned earlier on against Uruguay, because truthfully, they just weren't as good. Some new names had emerged, like Mohamed Kudus, like Thomas Partey, signing Iñaki Williams on an undisclosed fee from Spain, but they were still utilising the Ayew brothers to some capacity, and that means that you're setting yourself up for failure. Both of them getting substituted off at the same time, like they've been sent to detention in the same class. The parents' evening will have been an absolute disaster. Quite frankly, at this point, Ayew-related terrorism has hurt far too many people across the whole continent now.
What would you want to be in future?
I would like to be a terrorist.
Which brings us to the present day, alright? Now, Ghana are ready to qualify for the African Cup of Nations off the back of 2 pretty horrible campaigns, which I'll get into in a second. They're drawn against Angola, Sudan, and John Terry's favourite West African nation. Now, if you don't know about African football too tough, alright, I'm gonna break this down for you. This is a good group to be in. If you want to qualify for a tournament, alright, you choose these lot. Angola aren't bad, to be fair. They managed to reach the quarterfinals for the 2023 edition of the tournament, but they never made it further than that in their history. It's like playing Bournemouth or maybe Fulham in the Premier League these times. They'll give you a difficult game. They might even beat some of the big boys every now and again, but they're not going to finish higher than 10th in the league. Sudan are quite literally involved in a civil war at the moment, which is not only seeing them play all of their home games in a different country, being Libya, but is laying waste to an impending famine and one of the most catastrophic humanitarian situations that the world has ever seen. And Niger, I don't even know if Niger have ever done anything in a footballing sense in their history. What I'm trying to say is this is Ghana's group to win, okay? So when they started the group stages by losing to Angola in the 93rd minute, like Carlo Ancelotti when he faces any minor inconvenience, and eyebrows were raised slightly. But it's okay, it's the first game of the group stages, it's a little speed bump in the road. So when they then drew to Niger, less ideal. And then they drew to Sudan, even more like less ideal. And then they lost to Sudan. Ghana were 4 games into qualifying against pretty shocking opposition, and they'd accumulated 2 points. Now don't get it twisted, there were crazy upsets going on elsewhere in African Cup of Nations qualifying at this point. Nigeria had like lost to Rwanda at this point. It was all kicking off, but Ghana had not managed to recover, whereas all the other big boys had. Now the response of the president of Ghana's Football Association, Kurt Akraku, and we're gonna also get onto him later on too, was to deliver a 15-minute speech ahead of their first game against Sudan, the one they drew 0-0, which was also for some reason live streamed onto YouTube as if that was really necessary, where basically he was trying to give a rousing speech to the players and say that anything like he'd seen before was unacceptable. He'd seen players laughing and joking after defeats, and pretty embarrassing defeats too. Yeah, they followed that up by drawing 0-0 to Sudan and then losing to them the next time they played, leaving the Black Stars in a place where they would need to win both of their last 2 qualifying games and hope that Sudan lost their final 2. A country in a civil war right now. I have to remind you of that information. Now, this was possible when Niger slapped Sudan 4-0 in the opposite game, but Ghana still had to do the job against Angola. And the Black Stars may have been aligning in the night sky when Jordan Ayew scored a push-gas contender free kick from 35 yards out. This was incredible to say the least, given I don't even know if Jordan Ayew can see 35 yards in the distance anymore. So him scoring from there was a true miracle. Ghana's goalkeeper then saved a penalty just minutes later. In the build-up to qualifying, and a selection of Ghana's coaching staff, including their manager, had gotten away very lightly when they were involved in a car crash back in September, and the story was already kind of writing itself, okay? They were gonna come back from the edge of disaster and against all the odds make their way to AFCON 2025, where they go on and do something crazy, like Cote d'Ivoire did when they sacked their manager halfway through the last tournament. AFCON's crazy, man, innit? The problem is, Ghana aren't really the team of miracles anymore. They waste every opportunity they have. So when Angola equalised through Zini, and he found himself completely unmarked, like in a 6-yard radius away from any Ghanaian defender, in the centre of the 6-yard box, there wasn't really any surprise. Ghana make easy things look difficult, namely defending, and they capitulate late, often. In the first game of qualifying against Angola, conceded in the 93rd minute. In the second game against Niger, conceded in the 81st minute. AFCON 2022 was a disaster. They went out in the group stages of the tournament. That in itself was unheard of at the time, because they conceded late in a 1-0 loss to Morocco, drew 1-1 against Gabon, then lost 3-2 to Comoros of all teams, thanks to, again, late goals. Then at AFCON 2024, they just recycled the script again, remixing it purely to insert different teams into the mix. Conceded in the 92nd minute to Cape Verde, then in truly embarrassing fashion, conceding 2 goals after the 90th minute to Mozambique to draw 2-2 and go out of the tournament in the group stages, even though honestly you could have accidentally qualified for the knockout stages at AFCON 2024 given the way the groups worked. As soon as the pressure is on, late in a game, they fall apart. And to add insult to injury, having already gone out and not qualified for AFCON 2025 after the draw versus Angola, they then played their final game against Niger, which didn't even matter whatsoever, and lost 2-1 thanks to a late goal again. And both goals were just shocking defending again from set pieces. Mohamed Kudus missed a penalty in like the 96th minute of the game, and Ghanaian fans cheered that he'd missed it. This is not black excellence anymore. It is just black. But it should be, because the crazy thing is Ghana, it's not like they don't have good players. I talked about some of the key men they'd lost between 2014 and 2018, and don't get it twisted. Asamoah Gyan, Michael Essien, and Sully Muntari are some of the best players that Ghana have ever produced. But right now, they've got intercontinental boxing champion Mohamed Kudus. They managed to sign Iñaki Williams and Tariq Lamptey. Abdul Fatawu from Leicester is a baller. AFCON's very own Al-Qaeda, the Ayew brothers, to be fair, do stuff at times. Thomas Partey, who then again does play for Arsenal, so is used to being second best in most scenarios. Look, I realise I've listed these lot as if they're bad, but as far as an AFCON squad is concerned, compared to other teams, this is very, very strong. This is a team that should be competing to win the African Cup of Nations. A team that should be at the very least, getting to the quarterfinals. There are not 7 teams, like pound for pound, on paper better than Ghana in Africa right now. I'd say Morocco are, I'd say Nigeria are, I'd say Cote d'Ivoire are, Egypt and Senegal. But that's it. Like, genuinely, and even then for some of them it's pretty close still. So it's not the players, but coaching definitely might have an impact as to why this is happening. There have been 7 changes of manager since Avram Grant left the post as boss in 2017. That was 7 years ago. You don't need a new manager every year. It's not FIFA, okay? We don't need a new one every 12 months. Now, Chris Hughton was in charge after the absolute disaster class that was the most recent AFCON tournament that they qualified for, which was obviously in Ivory Coast. And to be honest with you, the way Chris Hughton played didn't really suit Ghana. I don't think they've got quite a lot of exciting, interesting, and like explosive wingers and attacking players, and they tried to rely on a defense that isn't very good. I'm not gonna lie, Ghana tried to play very cautious football at that tournament. Defensively is Ghana's weakness right now. If you're relying on Daniel Amati for like 8 years at a time, then don't put extra pressure on a defense. It doesn't need it at that point. So when Otto Addo, the current manager, returned, there was like some kind of high spirits that Ghana would at least return to some sort of like attacking and, you know, flair-filled play. But honestly, the results under him have been even more offensive. Almost as offensive as him running onto the pitch in joy when Ghana scored to equalise against Niger in a game that didn't matter because they'd already been eliminated from the tournament a year before it even started, only for them to then lose the game in the 93rd minute anyway. He was practically bursting onto the turf only to be embarrassed again. His whole reign has just been tactical ineptitude from start to finish. The guy, he's not a good coach, and Ghanaian journalists have been telling him that.
Well, then I think you scouting is better than you coaching.
So coaching and lack of direction is clearly part of the reason here. Not only is there pretty lackluster and uninspiring managers being appointed by the Ghanaian FA, which, to be honest with you, the head of that association has to take a lot of accountability for, but there's then no cohesion because, I don't know, tactically they're changing things up every 12 months. Not only that though, it's actually hard to pick a team and actually select a starting 11 for Ghana because so often their key players aren't actually readily available. I talked about the players that they have got, but when was the last time you ever saw any of them play together? Antoine Semenyo and Tariq Lamptey were both withdrawn from the most recent squad. Thomas Partey so often has to withdraw through injury and then returns to Arsenal like 16 minutes later. Andre Ayew's basically retired at this point, so there's just no leaders half the time when they play. But the fact of the matter is, there might be some good players in the team right now, and selection issues make it hard for them to all play together, and then just pure pure bad management means that often we don't get the maximum out of the players that do eventually make the journey to international duty. But the fact of the matter is, the Ghanaian national team still isn't as good as it was back in 2010. It still wasn't as exciting, and there still wasn't as many good young players coming through the system. So why actually is that? Well, first of all, youth development has fallen off a cliff completely. The end of the 2000s and the start of the 2010s was actually a complete golden era for Ghana, because not only did they manage to get to the quarterfinals of the World Cup and again be pioneers for African football there, they actually became the first African team to win the Under-20 World Cup just the year before in 2009. And that was a team that actually featured Andre Ayew at the time. It featured centre-back Jonathan Mensah, Dominic Adio, who would be the top scorer at the tournament with 8 goals. He'd go on to get 20 caps for the senior team. This was a good side. They had good players in that actually went on to feature at the World Cup of 2010. They beat Brazil, the Under-20s of Brazil, in the final. On penalties, yes, but still, they made it to the end and they beat one of the best teams for producing talent that football has to offer. But since then, it's been an absolute disaster. They may have won the Under-20s AFCON tournament of 2021, but in the last 4, they've only qualified for 2 of them. Yeah, they won 1, but they've missed qualification entirely for 2. They failed to qualify for the Under-17s African Cup of Nations, and have only made 1 Under-17s World Cup appearance in the last 15 years. So they're not producing good young players, and really, Mohamed Kudus is pretty much the only player that's successfully become an absolute, like, key player for Ghana that's come through the system since, like, 2014. There needs to be serious actual funding into Ghanaian youth development, because there isn't enough at the moment. There needs to be more funding going into infrastructure. The Ghana Man Soccer Centre of Excellence, they've been talking about finishing that for ages. It's a facility that's not in good condition. They had to do emergency work to their national stadium recently. Again, shows that things have just been overlooked for a long time. Maybe complacency settling in after doing so well at the 2010 World Cup and being promising at the 2014 version as well. Then you've got the fact that, again, from a training perspective, the facilities aren't too great, could be funded a little bit better, but also the lack of any actual, like, technology being used for data analysis. All teams everywhere sit down and actually study stats, right, when it comes to bettering yourself and working on a tactical system, analysing teams that they're going to be coming up against. Ghana don't even opt in, well, no pun intended, to Opta, which is like the key statistical usage database that most national teams utilise. And on top of that, their domestic league, which used to be so strong with teams like Hearts of Oak, has completely fallen apart in terms of quality, in terms of key Ghanaian players wanting to stay there. They tend to go off and play abroad, even at youth level, whereas they'd probably stay in Ghana till they were 20, 21 before making a move over to Europe beforehand. And all of this is happening and coincides with, practically, the most recent chairman or head of the Ghanaian Football Association, who took over in 2019, and the results since then in terms of managerial appointments, in terms of just like actual on-the-pitch results, in terms of actual funding for youth development, in terms of just anything that happens behind the scenes, really, has been so poor. There needs to be more of an impetus on actually making Ghanaian domestic football good again, making grassroots football good again, actually showing some love to stadiums and facilities in the country, and then also having some sort of stability when it comes to a coach and the playing staff as well, because I think like 60 players have been called up for international duty by Ghana in like the last 4 years. Yeah, I know England do that as well a lot. We brought fucking Taylor Harwood-Bellis to the last international duty, okay? But more often than not, it's a chance to integrate new players into the team based on like good form. Whereas for Ghana, they're just chopping and changing because they're getting desperate. Overall, fucked. That's pretty much the long and short of it. There's a lot of reasons why Ghana have completely fallen apart as a footballing nation over the last 5 years especially. There's gonna need to be some serious changes from top to bottom, from the top of the Football Association all the way through to the coaching staff, and to be honest, down into grassroots level as well, which is bad. I don't mean to state the obvious, but when the top, middle, and bottom of the pyramid are all functioning badly, it's gonna take a while to get back to where they were before. But who are the new shining beacons of light for African football? Because for where Ghana have failed miserably recently, we have seen the emergence of new African superpowers doing well at the World Cup, the likes of Morocco. There are teams currently with sensational African talent. Nigeria should be doing a lot better. Please don't grill me about them in the comments as well, I'm begging you. You may at least be able to take over from the Black Stars. Because although that team of the 2010 World Cup may have been a pinnacle as far as Ghana are concerned, or certainly since, they definitely inspired a new generation of African footballers from across the continent, which have been able to provide for their respective nations since. That though is going to wrap up this video, and I hope you have enjoyed it. Ghanaian supporters or residents or footballing fans, let me know what you think about the nation as a whole right now from a footballing perspective, okay? What are the reasons for you guys as as to why Ghana are falling apart so much recently, and what is the future? You know, how do Ghana rise from these ruins footballing wise at the moment? If you have enjoyed though, feel free to slap a like on the video, subscribe if you are new. You can also become a channel member as well down below. If you hit the join button, it's like the easiest way to support the channel. You also get yourself some perks, including early access to videos and content like this one. And you can also follow me on social media. It is at @officialfng on Twitter and on Insta. It's been a pleasure ranting at you guys today. Have a wonderful day, enjoy yourselves, and goodbye.